The boardroom on the 40th floor looked like it had been designed to make people feel small. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls caught the bright morning light, casting it across a glossy walnut table that stretched from one end of the room to the other. A luxury clock ticked quietly on the wall, but the only sound breaking the silence was the soft tap of heels echoing across the polished stone floor. A black woman walked in, back straight gaze, calm. Everything on her was simple in the most refined way. A gray-blue suit with no flashy label. Curly hair neatly tied at the nape of her neck. Shoes that did not shine but carried the quiet authority of someone who had walked through thousands of rooms like this without needing anyone to open the door first. Olivia Johnson did not need an introduction. She simply extended her hand, the bare minimum gesture of politeness in the world of business. What might seem like a simple act became in that moment the clearest signal of what lay beneath all this polished surface. Leonard Harrison reacted without hesitation. He glanced at her hand, then looked up with a mixture of arrogance and disdain. His lips curled slightly, as if this moment was beneath explanation. "I do not shake hands with staff," he said, voice flat and steady, but colder than the tempered glass behind him. A few people in the room held their breath. Others tried to swallow the uneasy smiles tugging at their lips. Olivia showed no reaction, no frown, no eye roll, not even the twitch of a muscle. She calmly pulled her hand back like it was something she had done hundreds of times before. She took her seat, her eyes level, neither lowering nor challenging. "I am not staff," she said. Her voice was soft, but it traveled just far enough for everyone in the room to hear. Harrison laughed. A dry, brittle laugh that scraped the air like a janitor's broom across office tiles at the end of a long day. He turned to his associates, a group of men in matching gray suits, same haircuts, same guarded stares, same little raise of the eyebrows that said everything without saying anything. "Then what are you doing in my building?" he asked. Olivia did not answer right away. Instead, she opened a brown leather briefcase, not glossy like they expected, but stitched with perfection. She pulled out a thin folder, placed it gently on the table, and spoke like she was stating something trivial. "I am reviewing the possibility of withdrawing a $2 billion investment from your company." Her voice did not rise. She did not emphasize anything. It was as if she were discussing whether or not to buy a modest piece of property. But the room froze. Every motion ceased. Harrison blinked, and for the first time his gaze held a trace of confusion. The confusion of a man who had just realized the hand he refused to shake might be holding the lever to his entire empire. At the far end of the table, one man tapped his phone. Another glanced at the door as if waiting for a signal from someone outside. Olivia remained still, hands folded gently, her composure unbroken. Every word, every glance, every breath was being recorded by a mind sharpened through decades of walking corridors, where she was never expected but always present. She knew the game of handshakes, the game of subtle looks, the game of quiet evaluations that carried enormous weight. She knew how to sit still and make others rise. And she knew that today in this very room would mark not just the turning point of one company, but a story that would ripple across countless other rooms carried by those who had once offered a hand and been refused. But in that moment, no one else truly grasped the situation. Harrison still believed he was steering the ship. The men around him still thought they were on top. And Olivia, as always, did not need to raise her voice to make them understand what was coming. She would simply watch. Then, at the right moment, she would gently place the first stone to collapse the mask they had built out of hollow confidence and practiced charm. The story had just begun. But that refused handshake had already opened a door no one saw coming. Before the rejection was spoken, and long before the disdain in that boardroom on the 40th floor, it all began with a morning that seemed perfectly ordinary. Olivia Johnson drove her silver sedan into the parking lot of Renova Technologies, where glass walls caught the sunlight like proud mirrors. No private driver, no flashy SUV. She chose to arrive like any regular person because she understood that humility is sometimes not just a choice, but a strategy. She stepped out of the car carrying her familiar leather briefcase dressed in a soft gray suit that hugged her form with nothing extra and nothing lacking, just like the poise that had defined her name for the past 2 decades. As she walked through the carpeted halls, her eyes paused briefly at the Golden Company sign engraved on granite. Renova Technologies, the pinnacle of innovation, a symbol of ambition and speed. But Olivia was not here for the surface gleam. What she cared about was what lay behind the polished mask everyone worked so hard to maintain. When she entered the main lobby, she was greeted by a professional smile from a receptionist named Miranda. That smile dropped the moment Miranda's eyes met Olivia's. Not because Olivia was late, and not because she lacked an appointment, but because she did not fit the image people expected when hearing the term major investor. "I have at 10 o'clock with Mr. Leonard Harrison," Olivia said, her voice steady and soft. Miranda raised her eyebrows, visibly surprised. "You must be the candidate for the admin position. HR's on the 3rd floor," she said, with a tone that carried both pity and doubt. "I have a direct appointment with Mr. Harrison." Olivia repeated without irritation, without needing validation. "Olivia Johnson." The receptionist checked the computer, suspicion written all over her face. "Yes, please have a seat over here," she said, gesturing toward a row of side chairs with no complimentary coffee, no private receptionist, and no gentle lighting, like the VIP area where 2 white men sat being served water and pastries in tall glassware. Olivia did not react. She simply nodded and walked to the plain chair, sitting down with the same calm as if she had chosen it herself. She opened her phone and glanced through financial reports, but her eyes observed the entire lobby. She took note of everything: the ratio of men to women passing by, their ethnicities, how they interacted, and the silent glances thrown her way, some quick and quiet, but all too familiar. Some looked at her and whispered something to one another. Some did not even bother to glance. No one asked if she needed help. No one smiled. It was all too familiar. For 20 years, she had walked into more buildings like this than she could count, met more people like Miranda and those suited men than she cared to remember. And every time Olivia did not get angry, she did not feel hurt. She took notes. She remembered. She turned every moment into a puzzle piece in the full picture of corporate culture she was here to assess. She was not just here to find a company worthy of investment. She was here to gather proof of something she believed was widespread but rarely called out by name. After 45 minutes of silence, with no one offering water, no one checking in, a man in a white shirt appeared. His name was Devon, and he introduced himself as the executive assistant. "Miss Johnson, if you would follow me." Olivia closed her phone, gently stood up, and followed without a single word of complaint. Devon did not lead her to the main boardroom where she had sat with other CEOs before. Instead, he took her to a smaller room, one with no windows, no greenery, and a wooden table slightly scratched at the corner. 4 mismatched office chairs surrounded it. Harrison was already there, scrolling on his phone, not even lifting his head when she entered. He simply raised a hand as if to say, "Sit down." 3 other men were present, all dressed identically as if produced from the same corporate assembly line. They looked her over with the kind of glance used to appraise something unexpected and possibly unwelcome. One of them even stifled a yawn as if her presence was a chore. Olivia sat her face, composed as always, but her mind already calculating. She knew every detail was deliberate. The small meeting room instead of the grand one, the wait time, the way she had been categorized from the moment she walked in. These were not administrative oversights, they were signals, a way of saying she did not belong here. But Olivia had not come to be welcomed. She had come to confirm what she had long suspected and to see just how far they would let their disrespect go before the truth came crashing in. On the table, there was no coffee, no pre-prepared materials, just a stillness in the air, thick with the kind of ignorance that made them unaware they were the ones under scrutiny. And Olivia, like a patient archaeologist, kept digging through the layers of bias silently, bit by bit. Because she knew sometimes silence is the most powerful way to speak. The air inside the small room felt like it was compressed by a silent layer of invisible glass. No one spoke first. The silence clung to the walls like it had been rehearsed. Finally, Harrison lowered his phone and looked at Olivia for the first time. His eyes scanned her like a document he had already judged before reading. He did not bother with greetings, did not offer her coffee or water, only opened with a question soaked in stiff courtesy. "So what diversity program are you here for today?" he asked, voice dry and mechanical. Olivia was used to that kind of opener. It happened often enough to become predictable in rooms where people never truly understood who she was or what she represented. "I am here to discuss potential investment opportunities," she said calmly. Her tone was neutral, without a hint of trying to prove herself. Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Investment," he repeated, letting the word hang in the air like it did not quite belong to her. "Which firm are you with?" He followed up, the suspicion in his voice no longer subtle. Olivia did not answer right away. Her phone vibrated. A short message from the CFO popped up. "All systems green. Proceed or withdraw based on your discretion." She read it, closed her phone, and looked up with a quiet confidence. Harrison began his presentation. His voice filled the room with overused buzzwords and colorful diagrams that tried too hard to impress. He talked like a man used to being the smartest in the room. "Here is an algorithm, you understand this part, right?" he asked, pointing to a chart so simple it could have been drawn by a child. One of his associates chuckled under his breath. Another sighed like he had somewhere better to be. Olivia did not react. She leaned forward slightly and said, "Your white paper mentions a proprietary deep learning structure. Can you walk me through how that differs from standard transformer models, especially in terms of inference latency when deployed at scale?" The room went quiet. For a moment, even the ticking of the wall clock felt louder. Harrison paused. His fingers tightened around the remote. "That is more technical. I think the CTO should explain," that he mumbled. Olivia stayed composed. "I also noticed in your Q2 report that R&D expenses dropped by 22% while you were announcing a research expansion. How was that reallocation justified strategically?" Harrison shifted in his chair, tapping quickly to move away from the financial slides. I think that may be outside the scope of our meeting today. We should probably stick to diversity topics. That would be more appropriate, he said, as if drawing a line she was not meant to cross. In his mind, red flags were going up. This woman knew the numbers. She understood the tech. And worst of all, she was not here to be impressed. But instead of adjusting, Harrison dug deeper into the shell of pride that had protected him in rooms like this for years. "Let us take a short break," he said, and motioned for coffee. He turned to Olivia and smiled in that way, where the mouth moves, but the eyes do not. "How do you like your coffee?" "Let me guess, lots of cream and sugar." The words hit the room like a slap dressed as small talk. A few of the men smirked. One looked away. Olivia did not respond. She closed her notebook slowly. The sound of the leather was soft, but final, like a curtain drawing at the end of a scene. Her eyes met his without blinking. "Before we continue, I would like to review your executive team diversity stats," she said. Her voice remained calm, but it sliced through the air like a needle. Harrison flinched. He realized then that she was not here to be steered. He was not used to being questioned, especially not by someone like her. The meeting moved to a larger room with more people. Harrison called in reinforcements, including Marcus Phillips, the only black executive and the head of their diversity program. But Olivia already knew the rhythm. Every move from here on out was reaction, not strategy. They still thought she was auditioning. She was taking notes. When the questions ran out and every unspoken rule had been broken in plain sight, she would be the one setting the terms. But first, she would let them expose themselves. Pride has a way of revealing everything when it thinks no one is watching. They moved into a larger room, where natural light filtered through double-pane glass abstract paintings, hung slightly askew on purpose, and a long frosted glass table was surrounded by leather chairs with soft cushioning. Everything seemed curated to project a certain level of prestige. Yet beneath the polish, Olivia could still feel the tension thick in the air. It was not humidity, but a silent pressure radiating from the way the men in the room carefully avoided her eyes. Harrison was no longer composed. He had begun retreating into defensive moves, still trying to manage the optics, but no longer controlling the rhythm. And Olivia knew it was in that hesitation where the first cracks always showed. Harrison started by introducing Marcus Phillips, the only man in the room who was not white. Marcus is our Director of Diversity and Inclusion. Harrison said, his voice a mix of patronizing pride and shallow virtue signaling. Marcus stood and spoke with practiced smoothness, every word sounding like it had been rehearsed dozens of times. He talked about hiring initiatives, about increasing minority representation by 8% each year, about vibrant photos flashing across the slides. But Olivia was not looking at the slides. She was watching his eyes. Something in the way he blinked too slowly during the sensitive parts. The way he picked his words with surgical care told her that behind the polish there was strain. And when he finished, Olivia asked quietly, "What is the retention rate for the employees listed in those initiatives?" A simple question, but one that clearly was not in the script. Marcus paused. "I do not have the exact numbers," he replied. "Then, in the last 5 years, how many people of color have been promoted to senior leadership positions?" Olivia pressed on her eyes, never leaving his. Marcus looked over to Harrison for help. Harrison jumped in. "We have a mentorship program and are working on it, but change does not happen overnight. Rome was not built in a day." Olivia nodded slightly, acknowledging the metaphor. But she did not say anything more. The door opened. 5 older men walked in their hair gray at the temples, their suits tailored, their shoes polished to the point of reflection. Harrison stood instantly greeting them like golf buddies reunited after a long match. They shook hands, clapped shoulders, and exchanged satisfied laughter over shared memories. No one introduced Olivia. No one asked who she was or why she was there. She sat silently watching the minutes pass. 3 minutes. No one looked her way. 4 minutes. One man sat down and began scrolling through his phone. 5 minutes. Finally, Harrison seemed to remember her presence. He turned and gestured casually. "This is Olivia. She is here to talk about diversity." No title, no mention that she was the one holding the decision on the largest investment offer their company had ever received. Just Olivia, a name tossed into the room with no frame, no role. The others nodded vaguely. 2 did not bother to look. One, James Stewart, turned to the man beside him and muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "Just play the part. Her roll wraps by lunch anyway." Olivia showed no reaction. She picked up her pen and marked a small line in her notebook. Harrison turned toward her again, this time with a gentle tone that reeked of performance. "Perhaps you could share your journey," he said, pretending warmth. "I think everyone would be interested in hearing how you overcame your background." What he meant was the story of race of origin, of something they could praise as a personal triumph, so they would not have to talk about structural injustice. Olivia smiled faintly, but said nothing of her past. Instead, she began to speak about market trends, capital flows, demographic data, and long-term impact on business valuation. Harrison interrupted. "We already have analysts for that," he said with a strained grin. "We are more curious about your perspective as a..." Then he paused, leaving the sentence dangling. Olivia knew what sat inside that pause. It was not an invitation to share, but a command to self-limit. The door opened again. A man walked in wearing a deep blue suit, a silk tie, and Italian leather shoes. Harrison stood up immediately, his eyes lighting up. "Alan, great to see you." He shook Alan's hand with both of his eyes shining with a respect he had never offered her. When he turned back toward Olivia, his posture had shifted. Hands behind his back, voice deliberate, no more masks. "I do not shake hands with staff," he said clearly. The room fell into complete silence. A few men glanced at each other. A few looked down. No one objected. No one said a word. But they did not have to. That silence said everything Olivia needed to hear. Not about one man named Harrison, but about a system that had grown too comfortable treating people like her as if they always existed on the outside of power. And Olivia, without overreacting, without pulling out her phone, simply sat still. But in her mind, a decision had been made. Not out of pride, but because the data was sufficient, the evidence was plain. And the game had reached the moment where it would need to be rewritten. Olivia stood up slowly, no rush, no unnecessary movement. Her eyes swept across the room one last time, not to seek approval or agreement, but to log one final layer of observation for the report taking shape in her mind. She picked up her phone, typed a single word, and hit send. Execute. No one in the room noticed, too consumed by their illusion of status and power. She politely asked to step outside for a moment. Harrison nodded absently, his eyes already returning to Alan and the men he deemed valuable. The door closed behind Olivia without a sound, but it marked a clear boundary between what had been and what was about to unfold. She entered the women's restroom on the lower floor. It was empty. In that silence, she stood before the mirror, not to fix herself, not to gather composure, but to affirm that she was still the same person who had walked into that meeting with unshakable dignity. 3 deep breaths, not from anger, not from pain, but to focus. She dialed a number and lifted the phone to her ear. David, her voice came through clear and calm. Initiate phase 1. Both contingencies are in position. David confirmed, saying the teams were ready in the adjacent buildings. The first signals would be sent to market analysts to quietly raise doubts. Nothing obvious, nothing traceable. Olivia requested financial updates, cross-checks against industry benchmarks, and a full documentation package of today's meeting, including the audio recording she had lawfully captured under Georgia's one-party consent rule. Everything was unfolding as planned, step by step, quiet, but strong enough to shake the very foundation Harrison thought was untouchable. Upstairs in the conference room, Harrison was laughing with longtime friends, sharing stories about market expansion and weekend golf games, unaware that beneath the company's walls, a network of data had been activated like blood flowing through a newly awakened artery. When Olivia returned, she said nothing, but the air in the room had shifted. A few directors were checking their phones. One of the wall screens started displaying live market data. Turtoronova's stock had dipped by 1.2% in just 15 minutes. No clear reason, no negative news. Harrison frowned, but quickly brushed it off as typical market fluctuation. He continued as if nothing had changed, as if Olivia's presence had no weight, as if control remained firmly in his hands. But things had already slipped out of rhythm, just slightly softly, but enough to make those used to stability raise an eyebrow. Olivia sat quietly observing. There was nothing more she needed to do. The chain reaction had begun. But she knew one more move was needed to make the lesson stick. She raised her head and looked at Harrison. I would like a private word with you before I leave just the two of us. Harrison looked irritated, but eager to wrap things up. He agreed. They stepped into his personal office. The door closed, and for the first time that morning, the room filled with the density of truth. I want to go over my experience today at your company, Olivia, began, her voice steady. I was asked to wait 45 minutes in a non-VIP area. I was brought into a windowless meeting room instead of the main boardroom. I was lectured on basic concepts in a condescending tone. I was interrupted when discussing finance, referred to only by my first name in a formal meeting, and finally denied a handshake with the statement that I was not worthy of one. Harrison tried to interrupt, but Olivia continued. I recorded the entire meeting. Every detail has been captured legally under Georgia's one-party consent law. Harrison's phone buzzed repeatedly. Urgent messages from major shareholders lit up the screen. Olivia did not need to look. She knew what was happening. When he looked up, his face had lost all color. Olivia remained composed. I did not come here to humiliate you, she said. But the truth is, you did that to yourself when you assumed I was insignificant and chose to treat me the way you thought I deserved. You chose your role, and now you must accept its consequences. As she stood and walked out of the room, all that remained was an emptiness, where arrogance had once lived, and the quiet sound of an old world beginning to tremble from within. The shift in the atmosphere inside Turtoronovo did not come with slamming doors or raised voices. It arrived quietly, like a cold breeze slipping through a crack in the window, like the stillness that falls before a storm dares to howl. When Olivia stepped out of Harrison's office, her face showed no emotion, but within her, a series of calculated movements was unfolding exactly as planned. Her steps were neither fast nor slow, but steady enough to draw attention without demanding it. She walked down the thick carpeted hallway where moments ago glances had slid past her as if she were nothing more than a shadow. Now, those same glances began to waver. The people who once ignored her were now casting sidelong looks, and those who had offered mechanical nods were now holding their gaze just a second longer. Behind her, in the room where Harrison still sat the phone on his desk, continued to ring. A call from a major investment firm in the East, a message from legal counsel, an urgent email from the communications team demanding immediate assessment of potential market impact from unidentified sources. Every one of those signals was the result of a single move Harrison never saw coming because he had underestimated a woman who did not fit his image of power. In a mobile office set up inside a black SUV, parked a few blocks away, the Johnson Capital strategy team was monitoring the market in real time. On the large screen, the Terra stock line no longer hesitated. It was now taking a clear downward turn. David glanced at Olivia and gave a subtle nod, his face calm but focused. No press releases, no headlines. Just a few discreet calls to top analysts, a few whispers about internal concerns, and a slight shift in investor psychology was enough to spark the domino. This was not designed to destroy. It was a warning. But if they chose not to listen, then consequences were inevitable. Olivia took the tablet from her assistant and skimmed through the latest report on Terra, retention rates for employees of color over the past 5 years, pay disparities between staff at equal levels, internal emails shared by former employees legally protected despite NDAs provided to investors as part of standard risk evaluation. These were not just numbers. They were voices once silenced. They were proof of a system built on favoritism and quiet exclusion. Back inside headquarters, Harrison was confronting a reality slipping beyond his grasp. Internal meetings were interrupted by urgent calls. Faces that once smiled over shared lunches now began to question. A few board members requested an emergency session. Some major stakeholders pulled their funding for the upcoming marketing campaign. What Harrison once believed to be secure now felt fragile. Worse yet, there was no one to blame. No article to discredit. No statement to dismiss. Everything was unfolding as a natural market response. And that was the one thing he could not control, because it had no face, no form, nothing to fight against. Olivia returned to the reception area where earlier she had been told to sit in the guest overflow zone. She stood for a few seconds, locking eyes with the young receptionist who gave a nervous smile. Olivia nodded slightly, then walked out. No farewell, no need for acknowledgement. She knew that the faces that once dismissed her would now remember her, not because she caused a scene, but because she had done what few dared to do. She shook the ground with silence. Through the glass lobby, a digital ticker flashed in red. Terra stock had dropped 7.2% in under an hour. Staff moved past each other, whispering, none speaking aloud, yet everyone aware something serious was happening. Harrison stormed into a meeting room called the Strategic Advisory Board and ordered a crisis response memo. But every move he made now looked like a desperate splash in deep water, creating froth, but not saving a ship that had already begun to list. And Olivia, without turning back, without needing confirmation, stepped out of the building, leaving behind not just a shaken headquarters, but an entire industry beginning to feel the true cost of prejudice. As the name Olivia Johnson began to echo beyond the inner halls of Terra, Its effect resembled a stone dropped into still water. No promotion, no press release. Yet each ripple broke free, expanding outward, touching corners Harrison never imagined could be reached. It started with a single shareholder calling to ask who the woman in the morning meeting was. Then came a young financial assistant who froze while cross-checking potential investor names and noticed Johnson Capital Partners on the list. And then everything seemed to burst open at once. Financial analysts began digging through records. Investment algorithms picked up on patterns of coordinated capital withdrawal. Those who had heard of Johnson Capital in closed-door conferences now realized Olivia was not just an investor. She was the founder, the CEO, the architect behind one of the most powerful private equity firms in the American venture capital landscape. With more than $50 billion in assets under management, Johnson Capital was not just a fund, it was a voice. A compass for ethical investment, a firm that never hesitated to pull funding from companies with toxic culture, no matter how tempting the returns. Harrison sat frozen in his office as the screen filled with articles about Olivia Johnson. His eyes scanned the headlines. The first black self-made female billionaire to establish a fund centered on corporate transparency. The strategist behind several high-profile divestments in major tech conglomerates, a keynote speaker honored at global financial forums for connecting investment with social responsibility, and the woman he had dismissed as a junior staff member. He covered his face with his hands, as if that might erase a mistake the entire market had already witnessed. But it was too late. The stock price continued to fall. Emails from strategic investors were no longer polite inquiries. They were demands, directives, ultimatums for an emergency board meeting. He dialed Olivia's number. A soft voice answered, introducing herself as the front desk at Johnson Capital. "I need to speak to Miss Johnson. This is Leonard Harrison. She knows who I am." "I'm afraid Miss Johnson only receives potential partners who demonstrate cooperation and respect," the woman replied, calm and composed, her words striking clean and sharp. "Would you like to leave a message?" Harrison stayed silent, then hung up. A new alert appeared on his screen. Johnson Capital had just released a joint statement with 3 other major funds. They were reevaluating all potential investments in companies unable to prove inclusive and equitable workplace cultures. Renova was not named, but everyone understood where that message pointed. Harrison entered the boardroom where the other directors were already in session without him. They spoke quietly. Their eyes no longer held respect. A junior assistant walked in holding a thick folder. The key stakeholders were demanding an immediate briefing on what had happened in the morning meeting. The entire PR department was working frantically on a damage control statement, trying to redirect public attention. But what Harrison feared most were the whispers rising from within his own walls. Employees who had once remained silent now began sharing stories of discrimination. Old emails resurfaced. Comments marked by sexism and racism were pulled from internal reviews Harrison once thought had been buried in unread notes. He began to lose his breath. Everything was slipping beyond his control, not because someone attacked him, but because he had let the rot grow inside while believing his power was untouchable. Meanwhile, at Johnson Capital, Olivia was in a closed meeting with her legal and strategy teams. There was no celebration, no smugness, only steady confirmation that each step was unfolding according to plan. An assistant handed her a full transcript of the morning meeting, every word spoken by Harrison, time-stamped and documented. What she held was not a weapon for revenge. It was a mirror. She was not aiming to bring down one man. She wanted to force a system to look at itself. And Harrison, with all the pride he had built over 30 years, now stood face to face with a price he never imagined paying. A price not caused by technical failure or poor performance, but by a lack of respect. And in a world where credibility is the strongest currency, it was Harrison himself who emptied his own account with nothing more than a single rejected handshake. The next morning, when Harrison stepped into the main lobby of Johnson Capital, he no longer carried the air of a confident executive. His eyes scanned every receptionist, every chair, every piece of artwork on the walls by artists of color he had never heard of. No one greeted him as someone important. No one came to escort him. He was invited to sit and wait like every other guest. The woman at the front desk was polite but distant, informing him that Miss Johnson would meet with him shortly. Harrison sat down, his eyes drifting to his watch from time to time. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, then 45 passed. The same amount of time he had made Olivia wait in the Turtlerenova lobby the day before under the judgmental stares and tea offers reserved only for white guests. Finally, the doors to the main meeting room opened. Harrison stood up quickly, adjusting his tie, but no one came to welcome him. The doors simply stood open, waiting. No invitation. He stepped in his eyes, sweeping the room, and then he froze. A long conference table stretched from one end of the room to the other. Olivia sat at the center, wearing a finely tailored suit, her jewelry minimal, but clearly expensive. Around her were senior executives, legal advisors, and representatives from 3 major investment funds. No one spoke as Harrison entered. No one smiled. Every gaze landed on him like an evaluation in progress. Olivia did not stand. She looked at him and spoke calmly. "Please take a seat." Harrison cleared his throat, trying to reclaim the lead. "I am here to clear up some unfortunate misunderstandings. Turtlerenova truly values diversity and is committed to providing a fair working environment. If anything during your visit yesterday was less than welcoming, I take responsibility on behalf of my team." Olivia flipped open a folder in front of her. No one interrupted him. But the silence did not mean respect. It came from experience with empty apologies. They were waiting for substance. She looked at Harrison and spoke evenly. Mr. Harrison Johnson Capital was not simply planning to invest $2 billion in Turtlerenova. We had been evaluating the possibility of acquiring the entire company for the past 6 months. My visit yesterday was not a routine meeting. It was the final step in assessing leadership suitability. Harrison's hands trembled slightly. He glanced at his lawyer, who tried to remain composed, but already had a hand resting on the file in front of him. Olivia pushed a thick folder across the table. "This is a compilation of observations notes and documented evidence from yesterday's meeting, including direct quotes, behaviors, reactions, and financial data that expose the gap between your public statements and your internal reality. All of it is legal." Harrison opened the folder, flipped through the first few pages, and then stopped. His own words echoed in his mind like sounds bouncing through a hollow room. "I do not shake hands with staff. She is here because of the diversity program. People like her are usually weak in analysis." Harrison looked up, ready to respond, but a representative from one of the funds spoke first. 3 months ago, Johnson Capital invited us to join a new initiative for investment standards tied to corporate culture. Turtlerenova was the first test case. Ms. Johnson volunteered to lead the field evaluation. Another person added, "We are not against profit, But profit cannot exist without responsibility. In this era, those who fail to understand that will be eliminated by the market. Harrison clenched his fists. I am being targeted because I am a white man in power. This is reverse discrimination. Olivia looked at him not with anger, but with the calm of someone far too familiar with such claims. She pressed a button. A recording played. Harrison's voice rang out clearly. I do not shake hands with staff. The line was followed by faint chuckles from others in the room. When the sound stopped, the silence returned. There was nothing left to deny, nothing left to defend. Harrison lowered his head. He was no longer a negotiator. He was the one under review. Olivia pushed another folder forward. Not an acquisition offer. A list of mandatory changes if Terranova wished to receive investment from any of the funds present. A restructuring of leadership. Transparent performance evaluations. A policy of equal pay. And most importantly, periodic cultural audits with results made public. Harrison scanned the pages. Each clause felt like a cut across his pride. But he knew there was no other option. If he refused, he lost everything. If he agreed, he gave up the very position that had fed him for years. Olivia nodded gently. This is not a negotiation. This is the only path left if you want your company to survive in a changing market. As he left that room, no one saw him out. No one called him a leader. Only cold glances remained from those who once believed in him, now seeing him as a textbook example of an era that needed to end. And on the other side of the door, Olivia did not gloat. She simply made another note in her report. She did not come for revenge. She came to ensure change. And today, that change had begun. The next day, Terranova's board of directors held an emergency closed-door meeting, and Harrison was not invited. The chair he used to occupy sat quietly off to the side, empty, like a silent reminder of a power that had gone unchallenged for far too long. In that heavy stillness, Patricia Winters, the company's CFO, and the only woman in the executive board, presided over the meeting for the first time as acting interim leader. Her face showed no triumph. Her eyes held no fire. But there was something in her voice when she spoke that made the entire room pause. We have three choices, Patricia said, her words weighted like scales. One, we resist and deny, which will lead to lawsuits, loss of trust, and possibly total collapse. Two, we make a few symbolic gestures to calm public opinion and wait for the storm to pass. Or three, we look the truth in the face and accept that the culture we have built cannot continue if we hope to survive in the long term. The room went silent for a long while. Then Thomas Chen, a long-serving board member who usually remained quiet in meetings, stood up. He spoke about his daughter, an honors graduate in engineering from MIT, who had worked at a major tech firm only to be sidelined, interrupted in every meeting, and assigned clerical tasks, despite her contract clearly stating a technical role. She left the industry after 18 months, Thomas said, and I used to think she just lacked patience. But today I realize maybe we are the reason people like her walk away from this field. There were no tears in his words, but they carried the weight of a father who once believed the system was fair until he watched it slowly wear down his own child. No one objected after that. The board voted, 11 in favor, 1 abstained. That same day, Terranova released a comprehensive reform plan. The commitments were specific. Public salary ranges by position to avoid gaps based on gender or race. blind hiring practices in the initial screening phase to reduce bias, a dedicated mentorship program for underrepresented employees, and most importantly, a cultural evaluation system where results directly impacted executive bonuses. Not just for optics, but to ensure change would come at a cost to those who had once clung tightly to control. When the statement was released, the tech industry stirred. Large companies called urgent meetings. Some CEOs began requesting internal audits. HR departments, which once treated diversity programs like slogans, were now being asked to produce tangible outcomes. Within a week, 3 other companies announced similar reforms. A major investment fund in New York updated its criteria to include cultural assessments, and it all began with a meeting that was once dismissed with a woman who had her name mispronounced. Harrison, who was then trying to arrange a press conference to explain himself, was summoned by the board instead. He was asked to resign and barred from holding any leadership role for the next 5 years. The media headlines said what no one had expected. The man who refused to shake hands now found the entire market turning its back on him. But what captured attention was not the fall of one man. It was the movement of an entire system. Olivia did not hold a press conference. She did not appear on television. She only appeared at a financial summit later that month, where she was invited to speak about the future of responsible investment. In her short but powerful speech, she said, "We used to think culture was a luxury, something to discuss last. But I believe culture is a company's core asset. And anyone who thinks they can build an empire without tending to it will one day realize they built on sand." The entire hall rose in applause, not because she was a symbol, but because she had done what no one dared to do. She made change cost something, and gave the market a reason to no longer accept the old way. Back at Turtle reform began with the smallest of things. The free coffee in the main lobby was now available to all employees. Internal meetings started inviting new staff to speak. HR sent out cultural surveys to the whole workforce. For the first time in years, people who had once stayed silent were filling out every answer. No one claimed the company had completely changed, but at least they had begun stepping out from the shadow of a man who once believed shaking hands was a choice, and the market responded in the clearest way. Stock prices began to recover. Job applications doubled. Investors who had withdrawn were now reconsidering. But this time they did not ask only about profits. They asked, "What have you done to make sure this never happens again?" And for the first time, Turtle had an answer. Not written on paper, but shown in how they chose to act each day. 6 months after Olivia walked out of the Turtle boardroom, with an unfinished reform document still lying on the table, the tech investment world started talking about a new standard. They called it the Johnson Index, a way to measure corporate culture through concrete data instead of empty promises in presentations. But to Olivia, she didn't care about what it was called. What she cared about was whether each person inside the system truly felt seen, respected, and given the chance to grow. In her office at Johnson Capital, where sunlight stretched across the dark wooden floor, Olivia was sitting in a small mentoring session with 6 young analysts, all women of color from different universities, different hometowns, but all sharing the same experience of being underestimated because of their name's skin or origins. One of them, her voice trembling, asked Olivia how she managed to stay calm after facing so many insults. It wasn't a new question, but each time it was asked, Olivia paused for a few seconds, not because she had to think, but because she wanted the person asking to feel the true weight of the answer. She said, "I learned to turn every moment of being dismissed into evidence, not for revenge, but to prove something. I understood that if I let my emotions take over, I would lose control. But if I kept calm and patient, I could change not just the room I was in, but rooms I might never enter." Another asked how to know when to speak up and when to stay quiet. Olivia smiled. She said, "I don't think of it as silence. I call it strategy. Some things must be said so people know what you will not tolerate. But some things are better shown through action." She paused, then added, "I didn't build this firm to push back. I built it to create a space where people like you don't have to push back anymore." After the session ended, as the young women left, Olivia stood still, looking at the wall behind her desk where black and white photos marked key milestones in the company's journey. No award ceremonies, no speeches to thousands, just quiet moments, a midnight meeting, a long wait in an empty hallway, a handwritten letter from a former employee thanking her for being treated according to merit. To Olivia, those moments held more value than applause, because that was where real change began. Across the city at Turtlerenova's headquarters, Patricia Winters stepped up to the stage at the inauguration of the new leadership board. In front of her were the staff, the media, and even the investors who had once walked away. But no one left the room. They stayed because, for the first time, they saw a plan that had started moving beyond promises. She said, "Today is not the end of a crisis. Today is the day we commit that no one will ever be disregarded just because they are not like the majority. We were wrong, and we are making it right." Her speech was short, without fancy words, but it was met with serious silence instead of applause, because people understood that what mattered was not what she said, but whether those words would still hold when the cameras were gone. In the months that followed, Turtlerenova began releasing regular internal data. The number of women and people of color being promoted began to rise. Work groups were restructured to reduce division by race or gender. Marcus Phillips, once a symbolic figure for diversity, was now the chief architect of new HR policies with real authority and resources. An independent report on the company's progress was released, clearly acknowledging improvement, but also pointing out weak spots. Patricia did not reject the report. Instead, she signed it and promised to publish every next step of their progress. Olivia received a copy of the report one early morning. She read it slowly, line by line, then folded it and set it down on her desk. She didn't smile, but she let out a long breath, not because she had won, but because finally a small part of the system had begun to move. A week later, at the annual investment summit, major funds began referencing the Johnson Index as a mandatory part of non-financial risk analysis. A seasoned CEO stated that if corporate culture was not part of a company's valuation model, then every profit forecast would be incomplete. And when asked who started this movement, he simply said it was a woman who once had her handshake rejected. As for Olivia, she was in her office reviewing a proposal for a new program. A $10 billion investment fund dedicated to companies founded by women and people of color, not as charity, but as worthy investment. She didn't want to be remembered as the woman who brought down a powerful man. She wanted to be remembered as the one who opened a door and kept it open so others wouldn't have to knock. And maybe that is what true power looks like. not in holding people back, but in letting more people step in.